Okay, here we are for our third of 3 lectures on God and Empire, with a particular focus on ancient Judaism. So in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about how we got the books that we have, and what their relationship is to history. So there's a lot of information on these slides. I will definitely upload them to class, don't worry. So you'll have time to look at them in more depth if you want to. So it's going to feel fast, but don't panic. I don't want you to memorize everything on the pages. I want you to remember the big picture. So the Tanakh, or the written scriptures of the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, they come in multiple forms. So there's the Tanakh, which is the written, and then we'll talk about the unwritten part later. But the core part of the Tanakh is the Torah, which is the first 5 books. The Torah is, in Greek, it's called the Pentateuch, which, right, 5. So there's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? So these are the origin myth, the beginning. Genesis in Greek means creation. And the Hebrew name for this literally means in the beginning. And then Exodus, which means exit. And Leviticus, which is relating to the Levites, the priestly class, their law. Numbers, which is also a book of law. And Deuteronomy, which is also a book of law. So it's the earliest laws and origin stories that we have for the Hebrew people. Now, I've preserved some of our color coding here. I don't have all the writing because I just think that would make the slides too busy, but I'm going to review it here real quick. This is the period between the Exodus and the beginning of the monarchs, right? So this is ancient Israel. This is the monarchical period, so that's going to be Saul, David, and Solomon. And then this is the dual kingdom period, in which you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, which happens to coincide with the first temple, right? The one that Solomon built. And then there's the Babylonian exile, which includes the destruction of the first temple. That is reversed with the Persian Empire taking over the region. And that's how you get into the second temple period, this little pink line down here. There's a little gap in empires, but don't worry, Persia is followed up with, this is Alexander and Hellenism, the legacy of Hellenism. And then we had the Romans. And then we had the secondary rule of the Romans after the destruction of the temple here in 70 CE. So that's a review. That's what these little color codes mean. And so I've left them on this timeline so that we can relate the scriptures and when they make an appearance to their moment in history. So the documentary hypothesis of the Torah essentially says that there were 4 early documents that pertain to these early literatures, and they have different names based on what they primarily wrote, right? There's the Yahwist, which is the earliest one, and that's identified strictly by the writer uses Yahweh for the name of God. And then there's the Elohist, and that's the writer uses El or Elohim for the name of God. And so the fact that those 2 names survive in the documents is, or in the unified Torah that we have now, is explained by taking these 2 different versions of these early literatures and melding them together. And we see this maybe in the 2 different versions of Genesis, which is a part of your data visualization reading. I love that visualization. So those are the primary folks. And then there's the Deuteronomist, and that happens to be the person who writes a majority of the law-based scriptures. And so you have these 3 main people, and then there's the priestly writer. And this is the person that we think sometime after the Babylonian captivity took these 3 kind of different documents that are not really all the same. They don't line up perfectly, and streamlined them into telling one story about one God. This is not a universally agreed upon hypothesis. It is just a hypothesis, and it probably can never be ultimately proven, just like anything that has to do with something this early. So this is the best understanding that we have of the evidence that currently exists, which is that the early Torah, those first 5 books, originally had 4 different sources, or maybe 3, that were then put together and then unified and kind of glossed over to try and make them into a single document. Then there's the Tanakh. This part is the prophets, which may seem familiar. You might know the major prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then there's the minor prophets. They write smaller books, they cover, their scope of their prophecies are smaller and more particular. We're going to talk a little bit about their relationship to history, which is the oldest books of the prophets are Amos, Hosea, Proto-Isaiah, and Micah, which means that there is a version of Isaiah that doesn't look exactly like the version that we have, but certainly parts of the version that we have date back to this period of 750 to 700 BCE. Later we have Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk, and you'll notice that we're kind of getting close here to the Babylonian captivity. And now we have the prophets who are written down. And this is the first time that they're written down. This is not necessarily like when the prophet definitely lived and was writing, because we don't know as much about that. But these are when we can kind of project that this person was composing and these things were written into a tradition. And then there's Obadiah, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and Trito is Isaiah. And so this is really important, right? Obadiah, or Joshua and Judges, Samuel and Kings. Like these 4, the events of these things are here, right? So it's important to note that the first time that these are really recorded into a finalized form is here, which means everything before this is written is oral tradition, and that's really, really important. So the same thing with the Torah. I should have mentioned that explicitly, but this information, these prophecies, they are being passed down. They're just not being passed down in written form. And then we have Malachi and half of Zechariah, the other half, right? The first half is kind of earlier. And then we have Joel, Jonah, sometime in this window. That's what's happening here. Right, sometime within this window, we have the composition of the book of Jonah, but it is not at all clear exactly when that happened. And the Greek version of Jeremiah appears at this point. So Jeremiah would have been a Babylonian exile prophet, right? Somebody working at this point. We do not have a written copy until here, and it is Greek. You don't get a Hebrew one until 600 years later. So we've covered 2 of our 3 sections. There's the 24 books. There's the Torah, the first 5. There's the prophets, which we just covered, the major and minor prophets. And then there's the writings, or the poetic books. Well, not all of them are poetic. So there's the writings, or just the 2 of them. So the poetic books are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. These have a very different relationship to history. They're more accretive, right? If you think of the process of accretion, which means that they collect new pieces all the time. So there is not a moment when all the Psalms are composed, although many are attributed to David. People keep writing Psalms, and then those Psalms get incorporated into the written collection over time. And so those have a longer history of being copied because they keep growing. And then there's the 5 scrolls. A lot of this is attributed to Solomon, not all of it. The Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. So these, Ruth and Esther are not attributed to Solomon, but Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes are often attributed to Solomon, and these are also very highly literary and narrative works. They're not prophecies. Nobody prophesies in them. Instead, they write about people and experiences and feelings. And then there are the late books. And these are the books that are written specifically under the conditions of exile. So that's Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Chronicles. And these tell the story of the Jews as they are in exile in Babylon, and some of them are prophetic, right? Some of them are prophets. So these appear, right? Half the Psalms exist before Babylonian captivity, and half of them are written later, after during the captivity, possibly even upon return, and in the Second Temple period. Job is composed sometime in between. Job may well be the oldest tradition of the Hebrew Bible, but it's certainly not the oldest written one. And then we have the long period over which Proverbs are collected, which makes sense. They are just sayings of wisdom. And so over time, if a person says or repeats a wise thing, these things get collected together. And then there's Lamentations, Ruth, and where did Esther go? I don't know where. Oh, Esther, there she is. Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, etc. So these are attributed to Solomon, which would have been right here, right in here. But they are not written down until later. And then we have the late works, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel. Now, remember, Daniel is literally working at this point in time during the Babylonian captivity. It is not written down. Ooh, this is in the wrong place. Whoops. This should say BCE, not CE. So Daniel's not written down until 164 BCE. Then we have the Deuterocanonical Texts. And this is an important distinction to make because oftentimes the Hebrew scriptures are only spoken about in terms of being the, quote, Old Testament. And we're going to talk more about what that means and where that comes from when we talk about Christianity and supersessionism. But at this point in time, they are Hebrew scriptures, right? They are the sacred texts of the Hebrew people. And there are some of their texts that are still considered sacred, but not the highest level of sacred. So they're not scriptural, but they still discuss the history of the Jewish people and their relationship to God. And the Christian tradition will pick up these texts and for some time, not the whole history, the Christian tradition will canonize them as scriptural, particularly the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, but they're not a part of the Hebrew canon. So the Hebrew people, they definitely belong to the Hebrew people. They definitely believe that they recount true events, but they don't consider them to be scripture the way that later Christians do. And that's the book of Tobit, Judith, Maccabees. There's books of wisdom and additions to Daniel. So there's some extra parts in Daniel that get added much later. And these are all, it's not a matter of date that makes them non-canonical, right? Some of these are just as old as some of the written versions of the Hebrew texts, but it means that they just were not considered to be as fundamental to the practice of the faith. That's the written tradition. However, the written tradition did not always exist. And before it existed, there was an oral tradition. And once these scriptures started to be written down and preserved in this way, an oral tradition continued alongside them. And the oral tradition is largely a commentary tradition. And then that commentary tradition also gets written down. So there's the oral Torah, which are laws that are passed down from generation to generation, and it is essentially dated to and attributed to Moses, and it has almost the same level of sacredness as the written Torah, but it is just passed down orally. And then there is the Mishnah, and you might say it's a redaction. That's certainly what it's codified as. But what it does is it takes the tradition of the oral Torah and it writes that down, including commentary on the oral Torah. So it's a preservation of the oral Torah, but also an explanation of what the oral Torah contains, right? And the oral Torah is itself a commentary on the written Torah, right? And so that is actually after we get into the Common Era in CE. So the Mishnah starts to get written down to codify the oral Torah. And then after that, then once you've written down the Mishnah, that becomes a codified text, and you need more commentary and more discussion. And that's where you get the Gemara, and those are debates on the Mishnah, right? So it's a commentary on the commentary, which is a commentary on another commentary, which was a commentary on the Torah. Right? So all of this is a proliferation of commentaries that first start out as oral tradition and then later get written down. Once, after centuries of discussion and commentary, the community agrees on, the community reaches a consensus on which interpretation is correct, and then that gets written down and recorded, and then it gets discussed further as the faith goes on. The Talmud, right? So let's just put those dates of the Talmud back on that timeline so we can see everything in context, right? The Mishnah gets copied down in here, and then the Gemara starts to get copied down in here. And then if we recall, and we think back to the medieval tradition and mysticism, that becomes a new branch of this tradition of commentary and interpretation that takes a kind of different turn, but it's very much within the practice of the religious tradition. So what does all of this mean? That's a lot of information. I know it is, especially if you're not already familiar with the Christian Bible. But there are a few key takeaways, and then that's it. That's all I want you to focus on from this particular part of the lecture. Key takeaways are that the Bible, as a single book, whether it is a Hebrew Bible or a Christian Bible, any complete unified book that does not change and has all of these different texts together, that is not a thing, right? We spoke earlier about how the Hebrew texts are actually copied in scrolls. I just happen to have my scroll handy. Yeah, right. They're copied in scrolls. You get a column. Am I going the right? This is backwards. Sorry. This is an already read scroll. I should have rewound it. Be kind. Rewind. Yep. Okay. So Hebrew is read right to left. So I was making sure I have this right. So this text is stored in a column. You read your column, and then you move on, right? Blah, blah, blah. And each particular scroll usually contains only one book, right? Or separate text. So we're talking about, you might have the prophet Isaiah in a scroll, and then you'll have the prophet Nehemiah in another scroll, and you might have one big scroll for the Torah, or you might have to have 5 separate scrolls for the whole Torah. But what you're seeing here, this is an artist's reconstruction of the Library of Alexandria, and what you notice is the way this library works is you have boxes that store scrolls. So if you think back to the number of different books that we just looked at, I don't want you to memorize all of those, like the major prophets and the minor prophets, but I do want you to have in your head, wait, that was a kind of long list, right? That was a kind of a long list. And then there's the poetic books, and then there's the writings, and then there's the late books and the Torah, and that's like a lot of different stuff. They all would have been in separate scrolls. So when you think about the amount of space that a scriptural tradition would occupy in a pre-codex culture, now you have a sense of why this tradition, this textual tradition, was not so fixed and unified as if it's just like all contained in one book, right? This object tells you that what's inside here is one thing because it is one thing. But when you have a collection of 50 scrolls, thinking of them as just one thing and the boundaries are really solid, that doesn't make any sense. That is why there is a rich tradition of commentary and discussion and interpretation, because there was a lot more movement and flexibility in the way that people related to texts as sacred objects, right? The idea of like an absolute literal version of the Word of God, that is a very new invention, and it really depends upon our idea of a book. So that's important. Key takeaway. Another key takeaway is that Judaism is a living, changing, and flexible religion, adapting throughout history to serve the needs of the people who practice it. I don't know what happened to the rest of that sentence, but it's really important that we acknowledge that religions are not fixed, right? There is no true version of a religion that you can say is definitely the right one because it has some kind of relationship either to an original practice or an original text. Like, that idea just doesn't make any sense in this context. What you have is the survival of the Jewish people and their culture and practices, and you have communities who choose to embody that identity and those practices in different ways. Which leads us to the fact that not all Jews believe or practice the same thing. They're not a monolith. They're not all the same. There's as much variety in Judaism as there is in any belief system. And not all Hebrew scriptures are given equal weight, right? The Torah is given the most weight. And then there's sort of levels of being downgraded from importance from there, which means there is no sense of an absolute other than that which is contained in the Torah. The Torah is the kernel of the faith and its practices, and all the rest are the petals that bloom from that center. And the last key takeaway is that scriptures weren't even written down for almost a millennium, right? So when we think about how to interpret those scriptures, it's really important for us to remember that the things that got written down are as much a product of the time that they were written, like physically written, as they are of the moment in which they were first composed. And I use the word composed to refer to oral culture, right? So we know that the books of the Hebrew scriptures were composed well before they were written down. But we have no record of what might have changed in between the moment of being composed and the moment in which they were written down. And we know that the moment in which most of them were written down happened to be a moment of cultural change and crisis, right? And so we always have to ask ourselves, what role did the pressures of exile in Babylon play in the way that the Hebrew scriptures were codified and in the story that they told about who the Hebrew people were?